The night my daughter called to tell me I wouldn't be welcome at her wedding, I was in the workshop behind Riverstone Cottage, my hands covered in sawdust as I finished the ornate hope chest that would have been her gift. My chisel clattered to the floor when Olivia's words came through the speakerphone, her voice cool and detached as though discussing a minor scheduling conflict rather than excluding her mother from the most important day of her life. "It's not personal, Mom. The Bellevue Estate has strict capacity limits, and Chris's family has important business connections attending. We're trying to be practical." My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone who truly knows me calls me Maggie. For 28 years, I've preserved and protected our family's legacy at Riverstone Cottage, a property my daughter and ex-husband believe was lost in the financial aftermath of our divorce. What they don't know is that every carved banister, every meticulously restored window frame, every inch of this historic property has been maintained by my hands while my children were told we had nothing left. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph in my hand was taken 30 years ago. It shows me at 32, standing with 7-year-old Olivia on the stone bridge crossing Clearwater River, just steps from our cottage. We're both beaming, my daughter's small hands proudly, holding up a wooden bird she had helped me carve that morning. The joy in her eyes contrasts sharply with the worry in mine. This was taken just weeks before Robert announced he was leaving me for his executive assistant and launching what would become a vicious custody and property battle. The Thompson family connection to Riverstone Cottage began in 1934 when my grandfather, a carpenter who had somehow maintained steady work through the Depression, purchased the then dilapidated stone house and 5 acres along the river. "Too stubborn to fail" was how my grandmother described him, watching him work weekends and evenings to transform the crumbling structure into something beautiful. My earliest memories are saturated with the smell of fresh sawdust and the patient guidance of my father's hands over mine, teaching me to feel the grain of the wood and respect its natural character. "The greatest craftspeople don't impose their will on the material, Maggie," my father would say, guiding my small hands along a piece of walnut. "They reveal what's already waiting inside it. Remember that wood continues to live even after it's cut. It shifts, it breathes, it responds to how you treat it." That philosophy would become my North Star, not just in restoration work, but in navigating life's hardest moments, especially when everything I valued seemed on the verge of being taken away. I met Robert Thompson during my final year at design school. He was already 3 years into his career at a prominent development firm, ambitious and charismatic, in a way that seemed to promise security after my childhood of modest means. Our wedding was featured in the local paper, the creative daughter of a traditional craftsman marrying a rising star in modern real estate development. The cultural contrast was framed as charming, though it contained early warning signs of the values clash that would eventually fracture our family. By the time Olivia was 5 and her brother Jason was 3, Robert's career had accelerated dramatically. His specialty became acquiring underutilized historic properties and reimagining them as luxury developments. The irony that I was a historic restoration specialist wasn't lost on me, but I tried to build a bridge between our worlds. I established a small restoration business working on maintaining the authentic character of historic homes, while Robert's firm transformed neighboring properties into contemporary showcases. "You're wasting your talent on sentimentality," Robert would say when I spent hours recreating period-accurate moldings or restoring original hardwood floors that others would simply tear out. "There's no real market for tradition anymore." Each comment reinforced the growing distance between us, not just in our professional philosophies, but in what we believed constituted true value. When I discovered Robert's affair with Jessica, a project manager 15 years my junior, the divorce that followed was calculated and cold. Robert's firm had recently been acquired by Westlake Development Group, giving him access to a legal team that specialized in high-value property settlements. Their strategy was clear: minimize what I would receive by devaluing what I most treasured. Riverstone Cottage is a tear-down property on valuable riverfront land, Robert's attorney declared during an early mediation session. Its only real value is the acreage, which should be considered a significant marital asset for division. His voice carried the confidence of someone who saw only balance sheets rather than history, craft, or connection. What Robert and his attorneys didn't know, what no one knew except my sister Diane and my father's old friend James Sullivan, now a semi-retired estate attorney, was that I had already secured Riverstone Cottage beyond their reach. 6 months. Before confronting Robert about the affair, sensing the marriage was irreparable, I had quietly transferred ownership of the property into a specialized historic preservation trust. My father, recognizing Robert's growing interest in developing our riverfront land years earlier, had created a framework for this protection before his death. The legal structure established the cottage as a registered historic property with strict restoration covenants, effectively ensuring it could never be demolished or significantly altered from its original character. James helped me complete the paperwork, creating a trust structure that appeared to be funded through a modest foundation grant rather than personal ownership. "This isn't about deception, Maggie," James assured me when I expressed doubts. "It's about preserving something that was never meant to be a financial asset in the first place. Some legacies deserve protection from those who would never understand their true value." The terms of our divorce settlement included a payout for what Robert's team calculated as my share of the supposedly sold property. "I'm sorry about Riverstone," Robert said with practiced sympathy after the papers were signed. "But let's be realistic. It needed too much work to be practical for someone in your situation. The developers who bought it will probably bulldoze it next spring." I nodded quietly, accepting his condolences for a loss that hadn't occurred, knowing that sometimes silence protects what matters most. That evening, I returned to Riverstone Cottage alone, walking through rooms that held 5 generations of family history, and made a promise to the house itself. We're going to survive this together. In the challenging years that followed, I rebuilt my life around 2 parallel tracks. Publicly, I established a modest restoration business focused on historic properties throughout the region, gaining a reputation for authenticity and craftsmanship that kept me financially stable, if not wealthy. Privately, I poured countless hours into maintaining and enhancing Riverstone Cottage, applying every skill I had developed to preserve not just its structure, but its spirit. What my children never knew during their weekend visits was that the small apartment above my workshop, where I lived, was actually just one room of our family home. I maintained this careful fiction through a combination of strategic scheduling and selective access, always arranging to meet them at my commercial workshop in town rather than at the cottage. Robert, believing the property had been sold to developers who simply hadn't moved forward with their plans yet, never visited the area, preferring to have the children delivered to his new suburban home for his parenting time. "Why don't we ever go to the river anymore?" 10-year-old Olivia asked once, remembering fragments of those early years. "That's gone now, sweetheart," I replied, the half-truth heavy in my chest. "But we'll create new memories elsewhere." I justified the deception by promising myself that when they were older, when they could truly understand the value of what I'd preserved and the lengths required to protect it, I would reveal everything and welcome them back to the home that had been maintained for their eventual return. As Olivia and Jason grew older, they gradually absorbed Robert's values and worldview. The weekend visits with me became shorter and less frequent, scheduled around what they described as more important opportunities: internships Robert arranged, networking events, college visits to prestigious business schools. When they did visit, they often regarded my workshop and restoration projects with a mixture of embarrassment and condescension. "You could scale this into an actual business, Mom," Jason suggested during his college years, after Robert had financed his first business degree. Instead of these one-off restoration jobs, you could hire people, standardize the process, build something with real value. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony of his concern about my financial situation while I secretly maintained a historic property worth millions wasn't lost on me. I simply smiled and thanked him for his interest, knowing the gap between our definitions of real value had become a chasm too wide for casual conversation to bridge. I watched with complicated emotions as my children transformed from curious, creative young people who had once loved helping in my workshop into polished professionals who measured worth primarily in theoretical future returns. Olivia's trajectory particularly reflected this shift. From a girl who spent hours helping me catalog different wood grains to a corporate attorney specializing in acquisition law, her natural attention to detail redirected toward contract negotiations rather than craft. Her relationship with Christopher Reed accelerated this transformation. The son of a prominent real estate family with holdings throughout the region, Chris approached life as a series of transactions to be optimized. During our first meeting at an upscale restaurant in Westlake City, he asked about my little renovation business, with the kind of polite interest one might show in a quaint but ultimately irrelevant hobby. "Olivia mentioned you work on old houses," he said, cutting into his steak. "My father's company repurposed several historic districts downtown. Amazing how you can take these outdated structures and make them commercially viable again." I noted how Olivia watched me carefully during this exchange, clearly hoping I wouldn't launch into what she now called my preservation lectures. The disconnect between the values I had tried to instill and the life she had chosen was never more apparent than in these moments. Her subtle signals to keep my passion for historic craftsmanship contained, as though it were a slightly embarrassing eccentricity rather than the foundation of our family's legacy. But I never could have anticipated how completely these differences would come between us, or how the cottage I had secretly preserved would eventually become the centerpiece of a family reckoning that would change everything. The first real indication that my presence at Olivia's wedding might be in question came during her engagement party at the Reed family's modernist mansion overlooking Westlake Harbor. The invitation arrived on heavy cream cardstock, addressed formally to Ms. Margaret Thompson with a handwritten note. "Business casual attire. The event begins promptly at 7. I wore a simple dress I'd purchased for a restoration award ceremony the previous year, accessorized with my grandmother's amber pendant, modest but appropriate. When I arrived at the sprawling glass and steel structure with its valet parking and uniformed staff, the contrast with my daily life felt jarring. I found myself hesitating before entering, suddenly aware of the sawdust that might still cling to my skin despite my careful preparation. "Mom, you made it," Olivia greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek in the soaring entry hall. Her eyes darted over my outfit with a subtle assessment before adding, "Chris's parents are hosting a small group of their close friends by the main bar, but I think you might be more comfortable on the terrace where it's quieter." This gentle redirection wasn't new. Over the 3 years of their relationship, I'd grown accustomed to being politely guided away from situations where my profession or perspective might not align with the image Olivia was cultivating. What was new was the growing frequency of these moments and Olivia's increasing comfort with this arrangement. Later that evening, I overheard my daughter speaking to an elegant older couple near a dramatic ice sculpture that dominated the center of the room. "Margaret?" "Yes, my mother has dedicated her career to traditional craftsmanship," she was explaining with the measured tone one might use to describe an unusual but ultimately harmless lifestyle choice. "She's quite committed to preservation work even if her approach is somewhat traditional." "How unique that she's maintained such an old-fashioned skill set," the woman replied, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she sipped her champagne. "And how fortunate she must feel that you've been able to move beyond those limitations." Different generations approach success differently, Olivia responded smoothly, raising her glass. I'm just grateful I can ensure she's comfortable now, that her business has slowed down. The assumption that I needed financial support from my daughter struck deep. This child who believed she needed to ensure my security had no idea that I owned a debt-free historic property that I had personally restored to museum quality, a property that developers like Chris's family would pay millions to acquire, if only to tear it down for the land value. But the greater pain was hearing her describe my life's work, my deliberate choice to preserve beauty, history, and craft, as though it were a quaint limitation rather than a purposeful path requiring skill and dedication beyond what she had ever understood. These moments multiplied in the months following the engagement. Olivia and Chris purchased a luxury condominium in Westlake City's newest high-rise, and my invitations to visit became increasingly rare and carefully orchestrated. When I did visit, conversation was politely steered away from my projects or perspectives on historic preservation, especially if any of Chris's family or their social circle were present. We're planning a complete renovation of the Eastlake district, Chris's father mentioned during one such dinner. Clearing out those outdated buildings will revitalize the entire area. Knowing that Eastlake contained some of the last remaining examples of particular architectural details I had spent years documenting, I began a measured response about the cultural value of those structures. Before I could finish my thought, Olivia smoothly redirected the conversation. Mom has always been sentimental about old buildings, she interjected with a light laugh. But speaking of revitalization, did you tell Dad about the sustainability initiatives your firm is implementing, Chris? The subtle message was clear. My professional expertise and perspective were to be treated as personal quirks rather than valuable contributions to the conversation. Later that evening, as Olivia walked me to my car, she reinforced the point more directly. Chris's family is very focused on the future, Mom, she said carefully. Their development work is important to Chris's career trajectory. It might be better to keep your preservation concerns for when we're alone. 6 months before the wedding, I completed one of my most significant restoration projects, the full rehabilitation of the original craftsman workshop attached to Riverstone Cottage. Using traditional methods and materials, I had transformed the space that my grandfather and father had once used into a showcase of historical woodworking techniques. Every tool hung in its proper place. The workbenches gleamed with decades of use and care, and the original windows had been painstakingly restored to flood the space with natural light. It would have been the perfect setting to create Olivia's wedding gift, a hope chest incorporating wood from 5 generations of Thompson family projects. I had just begun selecting the lumber when Olivia called to discuss what she termed practical aspects of the upcoming wedding. The conversation moved efficiently through various logistical details until she reached what was clearly her primary purpose. About the ceremony and guest arrangements, she said, her voice taking on the precise tone she likely used in business negotiations. We've been finalizing the numbers with the Bellevue Estate, and their capacity restrictions are quite strict for the package we've selected. I waited, already sensing what might be coming next. Chris's family has important business connections attending, people who could be valuable to our future. And with Dad bringing his extended family and professional network, she paused. We're thinking it might make more sense for you to participate differently. What exactly does participate differently mean, Olivia? I asked directly. We'd host a separate celebration with you afterward, something more intimate where you'd be more comfortable. The formal event has become very networking focused. The carefully constructed explanation couldn't disguise what was happening. I was being uninvited from my only daughter's wedding. The justification, that the business connections of both Robert and the Reed family took precedence over the mother, who had raised her, revealed how completely Olivia had embraced a value system where strategic advantage outweighed fundamental relationships. I see, I said finally, my mind already calculating what needed to be done. And does your father share this perspective about my attendance? Her hesitation told me everything. It was actually Dad who pointed out the potential awkwardness with some of his colleagues who'll be there. He thought it might be best for everyone this way. In that moment, as I stood in my workshop surrounded by the tools and materials that connected 5 generations of my family, I realized that Riverstone Cottage, the home I had protected and preserved through decades of secrecy, had taken on a new significance. What had begun as an effort to maintain our family's legacy had now become a symbol of something more personal, my refusal to be erased from my own family's story. I understand your position, I said calmly. Before you finalize these arrangements, I'd like to meet with you in person. Some conversations shouldn't happen over the phone. After ending the call, I sat at my workbench, running my hands over the piece of walnut I'd selected for Olivia's hope chest. The wood's rich grain told its own story of growth, challenge, and resilience. Rings marking years of drought and abundance. Small imperfections that added character rather than diminishing value. I realized that the chest I had planned to create would never serve its intended purpose. Instead, a different kind of unveiling was needed. The next morning, I called my sister Diane and James Sullivan, the 2 people who had known about Riverstone Cottage all along. It was time to prepare for a family reckoning that had been 28 years in the making. "Are you certain this is what you want to do?" Diane asked when I explained my plan. "You've protected that place for so long." "I protected it for my children," I corrected her gently. "But if Olivia values strategic connections over family bonds, perhaps she doesn't value what I've preserved either." James was more pragmatic. "Legally, your position is straightforward. The property has remained in the trust with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee. You have complete authority to determine its future." "This isn't about legal options," I explained. "It's about recognition, not just of my right to the property, but of my place in my daughter's life. If I'm not important enough to include in her wedding, why should she benefit from the legacy I've maintained?" Over the following days, I prepared for a meeting I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. I gathered documentation proving my continuous ownership of Riverstone Cottage, trust documents, tax records, maintenance expenses spanning decades. I collected photographs showing the property's transformation under my care, from the nearly derelict state it had fallen into during my divorce to its current condition as a showcase of historic restoration. Most importantly, I worked with James to draft paperwork that would remove Olivia and Jason as the trust's eventual beneficiaries. Instead, we established provisions to donate the property to the Regional Historic Preservation Society upon my death, ensuring Riverstone Cottage would be maintained as a teaching facility for traditional craftsmanship rather than falling to developers. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" James asked as I reviewed the documents in his office. "Once executed, these changes will be difficult to reverse." I paused, considering the weight of this decision. I've spent 28 years preserving this home for children who now find me too embarrassing to include in significant family moments, I said finally. They need to understand that family legacy isn't something you can dismiss when inconvenient and reclaim when advantageous. After careful consideration, we added a contingency clause. The donation wouldn't become irrevocable until either my death or 1 year from the date of my meeting with Olivia, whichever came later. This provision left a door open, time for reflection, and, perhaps, reconciliation. A week later, Olivia agreed to meet me for lunch at an upscale restaurant in Westlake City. Her choice of location, a sleek, modern establishment where she was known and comfortable, was telling. As I entered, I spotted her already seated at a corner table, checking her watch and then her phone with the practiced efficiency that characterized so much of her life now. "Mom?" She greeted me with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've only got about an hour before my next meeting. You said you wanted to discuss the wedding arrangements?" Among other things, I confirmed, taking my seat and placing my bag carefully beside me. Inside was everything I needed for the conversation ahead, documentation of a truth that had remained hidden for nearly 3 decades. As the waiter poured water and recited the day's specials, I observed my daughter, her perfectly tailored suit, her polished appearance, the subtle signals of success and status she had learned to project. I searched for glimpses of the curious child who had once spent hours in my workshop, asking questions about different woods and traditional joinery techniques. That girl seemed very far away now. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the wedding," I began once we had ordered, "about my participation being adjusted due to capacity issues and networking priorities." Olivia nodded, already, reaching for her water glass. "I'm glad you understand, Mom. The separate celebration we're planning will actually be much more your style. Smaller, less formal." "Before we settle on that arrangement," I said carefully, "there's something you should know, something that might affect your perspective on family priorities." I reached into my bag and removed an envelope containing the first set of photographs. Images of Riverstone Cottage as it appeared now, its stone walls solid and timeless against the backdrop of mature trees, the gardens I had nurtured over. Decades framing the approach to the hand-carved front door. "What's this?" Olivia asked, her brow furrowing slightly as she accepted the envelope. "Take a look," I encouraged her. "It might seem familiar." As she removed the photographs, I watched confusion flicker across her face. Recognition dawned slowly as she studied the images of the cottage, the stone bridge, the riverfront that had featured so prominently in her early childhood. "This looks like, but it can't be." Her voice faltered. "This is Riverstone, but it was sold during your divorce. Dad said developers bought it years ago." "That's what everyone was meant to believe," I confirmed, keeping my voice steady despite the emotion building inside me. But it wasn't true. I placed a second envelope on the table between us. This one contained the trust documentation, property, tax receipts, and maintenance records spanning 28 years, all in my name. Riverstone Cottage was never sold, Olivia. I've owned and maintained it continuously since before the divorce was finalized. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the second envelope, her attorney's mind quickly processing the legal documents before her. "That's not possible," she whispered, looking up at me with genuine shock. "Dad said, all these years, he said it was gone. He told us the developers were just waiting for the right time to build." "Your father believed what I allowed him to believe," I explained. 6 months before I confronted him about the affair, I transferred ownership to a historic preservation trust with help from James Sullivan. The legal paperwork showed a sale to satisfy other debts, but in reality, I had preserved it beyond your father's reach. Olivia stared at me as though seeing a stranger, the carefully maintained image of her practical, somewhat limited mother crumbling before her eyes. "You've owned Riverstone all this time? While living in that small apartment? Above your workshop?" "While I've been..." She stopped, the implications of her treatment of me over the years suddenly taking on new meaning. "Yes," I confirmed simply. "For 28 years, I've maintained every inch of that property, not as a financial asset, but as our family's legacy. A legacy I had always intended to pass on to you and Jason." "Had intended?" She caught the past tense immediately. I placed the third envelope on the table. "In light of recent events, specifically being told I'm not welcome at my daughter's wedding, I've amended the trust. Upon my death, Riverstone Cottage will be donated to the Regional Historic Preservation Society to become a teaching facility for traditional craftsmanship." The color drained from Olivia's face as the full impact of my words registered. Her water glass tipped slightly in her hand, sending a small puddle across the pristine tablecloth. "You're disinheriting us because of the wedding arrangements?" Her voice held a note of disbelief. "No, Olivia. I corrected gently. I'm acknowledging that we have fundamentally different values about what family means. If I'm not important enough to include in your wedding day, then perhaps my family's legacy isn't important enough to include in your future. That's manipulative, she said, attorney instincts surfacing through her shock. It's consistent, I countered. I'm making decisions about property I've maintained for 28 years based on the values demonstrated by the people involved. You've made your choice about my place in your celebration. I've made mine about the future of our family's legacy. Olivia studied the trust amendment, her trained eye quickly finding the contingency clause. A 1-year window, she noted, before the donation becomes irrevocable. Yes, I confirmed. A year in which perspectives might evolve and choices might be reconsidered, on both sides. The waiter arrived with our meals, the elegant presentations contrasting sharply with the emotional weight of our conversation. Neither of us made any move to eat. Does Dad know about this? Olivia finally asked. No one knows except Diane and James Sullivan. Your father has been planning to tell you he discovered the property was available and wanted to reclaim it as a wedding gift to you and Chris. Her eyes widened at this revelation. How do you know that? James has connections in real estate law. Your father has been making inquiries about the property for the past 3 months, apparently planning to present himself as the one who recovered the family legacy. And Chris and I would never have known the truth, she murmured, more to herself than to me. That was my assumption, I agreed. Just as I assumed the original Craftsman features would be immediately demolished to create whatever contemporary showcase you and Chris might prefer. Olivia didn't deny this, her silence confirming what we both knew would have happened to the lovingly preserved details that connected 5 generations of our family. I need time to process this, she said, finally gathering the documents with hands that weren't quite steady. Finding out my mother has been executing a sophisticated legal and financial strategy for decades while maintaining a historic property in secret. It's not what I expected from our lunch. That's rather the point, isn't it? I observed gently. You never expected it because you never really saw me, not as a complete person with my own capabilities and wisdom. I became a character in your narrative rather than recognized for who I actually am. Olivia stood, collecting her things, with the practiced efficiency that characterized so much of her professional life. But something had shifted. The confidence that normally radiated from her seemed diminished, replaced by genuine uncertainty. I'll call you, she said, pausing beside the table, after I've had time to think. As she walked away, her normally perfect posture slightly hunched under the weight of new understanding, I felt neither triumph nor regret, only the calm certainty that truth, however long concealed, eventually finds its way into the light. The next 3 days passed in silence. No calls from Olivia, no messages, just the hollow quiet of relationships in crisis. I returned to Riverstone Cottage and my workshop, finding solace in the familiar routine of restoration work. Whether our family relationships could be similarly restored remained an open question, one that would depend on more than just my efforts. On the 4th day, my phone chimed with an unexpected message. Not from Olivia, but from Christopher Reed. Ms. Thompson, I'd like to speak with you privately about Riverstone Cottage. Would tomorrow at 2 p.m. be convenient? I can come to your workshop in town. The request surprised me. I had expected Olivia might involve her father, possibly even lawyers, but not her fiancé. After brief consideration, I agreed to the meeting, curious about what approach Chris might take in this family matter. When he arrived at my commercial workshop the following afternoon, Chris looked different from the confidently polished young man I had previously encountered. His expression was thoughtful, even tentative, as he took in the restoration project I was working on, a 19th century secretary desk with intricate inlay work. Thank you for meeting me, he began, his usual assertive tone noticeably subdued. Olivia told me about your conversation. about Riverstone Cottage and everything else. I nodded, continuing to carefully sand a drawer component while I waited for him to reach his point. She's been different since then, he continued. Quiet, reflective. She took me to see the cottage yesterday. This information genuinely surprised me. I set down my sandpaper, giving Chris my full attention. Olivia has a key? He nodded. She said she remembered where the spare was kept, under the stone bench by the workshop door. She wanted me to see the property before we discussed anything further. I smiled slightly at this detail. The key had indeed been there for decades, though I had never expected Olivia to remember its location from her childhood. "And what did you think of Riverstone?" I asked, genuinely curious about this development-minded young man's reaction to my life's work. Chris paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care. "It wasn't what I expected," he admitted. From Olivia's descriptions over the years, I had imagined something rustic, primitive. And instead, I found one of the most meticulously preserved historic properties I've ever seen. His professional assessment broke through his personal discomfort. The craftsmanship, the attention to period-appropriate details while incorporating modern systems so seamlessly, it's extraordinary work. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the professional acknowledgement that had been withheld in our previous interactions. What Olivia never explained, what I don't think she fully understood until now, is that preservation at this level isn't just sentiment. It's expertise, discipline, vision. He gestured to the secretary desk I was restoring. "Like this piece, most people would see old furniture. I'm beginning to understand that you see history worth protecting." The observation reflected more insight than I had credited Chris with possessing. Perhaps there was more to this young man than his family's development mindset had suggested. "Why are you here, Chris?" I asked directly. "I assume not just to compliment my restoration work." He took a deep breath. "I'm here because seeing Riverstone change something in Olivia, in me too, if I'm being honest. It raised questions about what we value and why." He moved closer to examine the desk's detailed inlay. "My family's business has always been about transformation, seeing what something could become rather than what it was. We buy properties, reimagine them, create something new and profitable. There's nothing inherently wrong with that approach," I acknowledged, "unless what's being erased has value that can't be replaced or recreated." Chris nodded slowly. "That's what I realized at Riverstone. Some things once lost can never be recovered, no matter how much money or technology you throw at the problem." He turned to face me directly. "Olivia doesn't know I'm here. She's still processing everything, not just the cottage itself, but what it means that you maintained it in secret all these years while letting her believe a different narrative." "And you? What are you processing?" "That the wedding we've been planning doesn't reflect what matters most," he said with surprising candor. "The guest list, the networking opportunities, the strategic connections, none of that seems as important after standing in that cottage and understanding what genuine legacy looks like." His words suggested a depth I hadn't glimpsed in our previous interactions, a capacity for reflection that had been overshadowed by his family's influence and professional ambitions. "What are you proposing, Chris?" I asked, sensing he had a specific purpose beyond this philosophical discussion. "I'd like your permission to bring someone else to see Riverstone Cottage," he replied. "Someone who I think needs to understand what's been preserved there and who's been excluded from the celebration of our future." The request was unexpected enough that I set down my tools entirely. "Who did you have in mind?" Chris met my gaze directly, his expression resolute. "My grandfather. My father's father." "Your grandfather?" I repeated, confused by this unexpected direction. I wasn't aware he was involved in the wedding planning. "He's not," Chris confirmed with a grimace. "That's rather the point. My grandfather founded our family's company, but he and my father had a falling out years ago over development philosophy. Grandpa James believed in adaptive reuse, preserving historical elements while finding new purposes for old structures. My father preferred the approach you're familiar with: demolition and new construction. And your grandfather wasn't invited to the wedding either? I surmised, beginning to understand the parallel Chris was drawing. He nodded. For reasons painfully similar to your situation, his presence might create awkwardness with my father's business associates. The official explanation is that at 82, he's too frail for such an event. The truth is that my father doesn't want to face questions about why his own dad isn't involved in the company anymore. The situation he described created an unexpected connection between Chris's family and my own, generational values in conflict, with the older generation's wisdom dismissed as outdated or inconvenient. Why do you want your grandfather to see Riverstone? I asked, genuinely curious about Chris's reasoning. Because I think Olivia needs to see him there, he replied. She needs to understand that what's happening with you isn't isolated or unique. It's part of a pattern of prioritizing appearance and advantage over deeper connections. Seeing my grandfather in your family home, recognizing the craftsmanship you've preserved, I think it might help her recognize what's being lost in the choices we've been making. The strategy showed more emotional intelligence than I had credited Chris with possessing. Rather than directly confronting Olivia about her treatment of me, he was creating a parallel that might allow her to see the situation more clearly through someone else's experience. Your grandfather appreciates historic preservation? I asked. Chris smiled for the first time since arriving. Grandpa James was a master carpenter before he became a developer. He built his first apartment building with his own hands and insisted on salvaging materials from the previous structure. The mantelpiece in his retirement home came from an 1890s hotel his company carefully dismantled rather than demolished. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect, a shared appreciation for craftsmanship across families who had been at odds. I studied Chris more carefully, wondering if there might be layers to this young man that Olivia herself had failed to recognize. What exactly do you hope might happen if I allow this visit? I asked. Chris considered the question carefully. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I know that seeing Riverstone changed something fundamental in how I understand Olivia's background and my own family's approach to development. I think my grandfather would recognize what you've accomplished there in a way few others could, and witnessing that recognition might help Olivia see beyond the narrative she's constructed about you. His insight surprised me. This calculated approach revealed depths I hadn't glimpsed in our previous interactions. Perhaps Olivia had chosen better than I'd realized, even if for reasons neither of them had fully understood. Your grandfather is welcome at Riverstone, I decided. When would you like to arrange this visit? Is tomorrow possible? Chris asked. Olivia has been completely preoccupied since your revelation. The sooner we can help her process this, the better for everyone. We arranged for them to arrive at Riverstone the following afternoon. After Chris left, I called Diane to share this unexpected development. This is either very promising or setting you up for more disappointment, my sister cautioned. Are you sure you want to open yourself to these possibilities so quickly? I've protected that cottage for 28 years, Diane, I reminded her. If there's even a small chance this visit might help Olivia recognize what matters beyond business connections, it's worth the risk. I spent that evening at Riverstone preparing the space not for guests, but for honest recognition. Unlike previous occasions when I'd selectively staged areas for clients or rare visitors, I made no effort to modernize or apologize for the property's historic character. Every room reflected decades of careful preservation and authentic craftsmanship, from the hand-restored crown moldings to the period-appropriate hardware I'd salvaged from similar structures before their demolition. The workshop particularly received my attention. I arranged my grandfather's and father's tools alongside my own, creating a visual timeline of craftsmanship spanning 3 generations. The half-finished hope chest remained on my workbench, its partially carved front panel showing the beginnings of the Thompson family pattern, a stylized river flowing through stands of pine, connecting generations through a shared landscape. When I heard cars approaching the next afternoon, I was in the garden harvesting late summer vegetables, another tradition maintained through decades of quiet stewardship. I straightened, brushing soil from my hands, and watched as 2 vehicles came up the gravel drive. Chris emerged from the first, helping an elderly man with a wooden cane from the passenger seat. From the second car, Olivia stepped out, her expression guarded and uncertain. The elderly man, clearly Chris's grandfather, paused as he took in the full view of Riverstone Cottage. Even from a distance, I could see his face transform with appreciation. He said something to Chris that made the younger man nod vigorously before they began making their way toward me. "Ms. Thompson," Chris called. "This is my grandfather, James Reed." As they drew closer, I noticed that James Reed's cane was no ordinary walking stick but a beautifully turned piece of walnut with subtle inlay work. The kind of personal item craftspeople create for themselves, balancing function with artistry. "Mrs. Thompson," the elder Reed greeted me, his voice stronger than his appearance might suggest. "My grandson has told me about your remarkable preservation of this property, but seeing it in person..." He shook his head in appreciation. "Extraordinary work." "Thank you, Mr. Reed," I replied, genuinely touched by the immediate recognition from someone who clearly understood what such preservation entailed. "And please call me Maggie." "Only if you call me James," he countered with a warm smile. "I understand we share more than our first name, a commitment to preserving craftsmanship that others might consider outdated." Olivia approached more hesitantly, hanging back slightly as though unsure of her place in this unexpected gathering. Her eyes moved constantly between the cottage, her future grandfather-in-law, and me, assessing, recalibrating, processing information that didn't fit her established narrative. "Would you like to see inside?" I offered, addressing all of them but watching Olivia's reaction most carefully. "Very much," James Reed replied enthusiastically. "Chris mentioned original woodwork that's been meticulously maintained." As we moved toward the cottage, I noticed Olivia studying the stone path beneath our feet. "You fixed the wobbly stones," she observed quietly. "I remember they used to rock when I jumped on them as a child." "Reset them properly about 15 years ago," I confirmed. "The original placement was beautiful but hadn't accounted for root growth from the oak tree." This small exchange, her childhood memory meeting my ongoing care for even minor details, seemed to momentarily bridge the distance between us. Something softened in her expression, a flicker of the curious child she had once been before professional ambition had reshaped her perspective. As we entered Riverstone Cottage, James Reed's appreciation became increasingly evident. His experienced eye noted details others might have missed: the hand-planed baseboards, the carefully preserved crown moldings, the original heart pine, flooring that had been reverently maintained rather than replaced. "Most people would have torn this out and installed something trendy," he observed, kneeling with some difficulty to examine a section of flooring. "The craftsmanship in these wide planks, you don't see this quality in modern materials." "My grandfather harvested this wood from the property itself," I explained. "The trees were already over 100 years old when he selected them in the 1930s. "So this floor is approaching 200 years of life," James mused, "and will likely last another century with proper care." He glanced meaningfully at Chris. "Unlike the engineered products we install in our developments with 15-year lifespans." Chris nodded, absorbing the implied criticism of his family's business practices without defensiveness. His willingness to consider alternative perspectives suggested a flexibility I hadn't previously observed in him. As we moved through the cottage, Olivia remained unusually quiet, absorbing everything without comment. When we reached the dining, room with its hand-carved hutch displaying my grandmother's depression glass collection, she finally spoke. "You kept Grandma's dishes," she said softly. "I remember drinking orange juice from those small glasses when I was little. You told me they were special because they came from a time when people had to make beautiful things even when they didn't have much money." "They were made during the Great Depression," I confirmed. "Companies included them free with household products as incentives when few people could afford to buy new dishes. Beauty and function were equally important, even in difficult times." James Reed examined the glassware with obvious appreciation. "My mother had similar pieces. Most people discarded them when prosperity returned after the war. Too common, too ordinary. But they represent an important philosophy, that beauty belongs in everyday life, not just in luxury." The parallel between the glassware and my own work at Riverstone wasn't lost on anyone in the room. I had maintained beauty and craftsmanship through decades when others might have embraced more convenient or fashionable alternatives. Our tour continued to the heart of the property, my workshop. As we entered the converted carriage house with its soaring ceiling and north-facing windows providing perfect natural light, James Reed stopped in the doorway, visibly moved. "This," he said quietly, "is sacred space." The word choice struck me powerfully. Sacred was exactly how I had always felt about this workshop, not in a religious sense, but as a place where deeper values were honored and preserved. That this man, a stranger until today, would recognize this instinctively created an immediate connection between us. He moved slowly through the space, touching tools with the reverence of someone who understood their significance. When he reached my workbench with the partially completed hope chest, he paused, studying the carved panel without speaking. "It was meant to be Olivia's wedding gift," I explained, addressing his unspoken question. "A hope chest incorporating wood from 5 generations of Thompson family projects." Olivia stepped forward, her hand hovering over the carving without quite touching it. "This is our family pattern," she said softly. "The river flowing through the pines." "Your great-grandfather created it," I confirmed. "Every generation has incorporated it into significant pieces. Your grandmother's cedar chest has it along the sides. The cradle I made when you were born features it on the headboard." "The cradle," Olivia repeated, her voice catching slightly. "I never knew you made that. Dad always said it was an antique he had purchased." The revelation of another small deception seemed to affect her deeply, another piece of her family history rewritten to minimize my contribution. She turned to me with genuine confusion in her eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell me? About Riverstone? About your craftsmanship? About any of this?" The question contained layers of hurt and bewilderment. I considered my response carefully, aware that this moment might define our future relationship. "At first, it was about protection," I began truthfully. "The legal maneuvers during the divorce made it clear that anything I openly valued would become a target. Then, as you and Jason grew older and began absorbing your father's values, there seemed fewer opportunities to share these truths without them being dismissed or misunderstood." I gestured around the workshop. "This isn't just about property or craftsmanship, Olivia. It's about an approach to life, valuing substance over appearance, care over convenience, legacy over temporary advantage. Those haven't been the priorities you've demonstrated in recent years." James Reed nodded in understanding, though the conversation wasn't directed at him. "It's a common pattern across generations," he offered. "My son, Chris's father, made similar choices. The company I built focused on preserving architectural history while finding new purposes for significant structures. Under his direction, it became about maximizing profit margins through demolition and new construction." He turned to Chris. "Which is why I wasn't surprised to learn I wouldn't be welcome at your wedding. My presence might raise uncomfortable questions about why The company's founding philosophy has been abandoned. Chris looked down, acknowledging the truth in his grandfather's assessment. We justified it as protecting you from a long, tiring event, he admitted. But the real concern was how your perspective might conflict with the business narrative Dad has constructed. The parallel between our situations hung in the air. 2 elder family members excluded from a significant celebration because our values didn't align with the image being cultivated, our expertise dismissed as outdated rather than recognized as wisdom. Olivia moved to the workbench, studying the hope chest more closely. You were making this for me even after I told you about the wedding arrangements? Even knowing I wouldn't want you there? I started it before that conversation, I clarified. Afterward, I realized it would never serve its intended purpose. Something shifted in her expression, a recognition of loss that went beyond the physical object. Her fingers traced the partially carved river pattern, following its flow across the unfinished wood. I don't understand how we got here, she said finally. How did I become someone who would exclude her own mother from her wedding? Who would dismiss all of this? She gestured around the workshop, encompassing everything it represented, as irrelevant to my life. The vulnerability in her question touched me deeply. This wasn't the polished attorney projecting confidence and control, but a young woman suddenly recognizing a disconnect between her actions and deeper values she hadn't realized still existed within her. We become what we practice, James Reed said gently when I didn't immediately respond. Surround yourself with people who value strategic connections and material success above all else, and gradually those become your measures too. It happens. So incrementally you don't notice the shift until something forces you to see the contrast. Chris moved to stand beside Olivia, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. That's what happened when I saw Riverstone, he told her. Suddenly, the distinction between what we've been pursuing and what truly lasts became impossible to ignore. First, Olivia looked around the workshop, taking in the generations of tools organized on the walls, the projects in various stages of completion, the atmosphere of patient dedication that permeated the space. Then her gaze returned to me, seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time in many years. I've underestimated you, she said simply. Not just your skills or what you've preserved here, but everything about who you are. I created a narrative where you were limited, struggling, in need of my help or guidance. That story was comfortable because it made my choices seem like progress rather than something else. The admission reflected a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected. Olivia had always been perceptive about others' motivations, but rarely applied that same insight to her own choices. And now? I asked quietly. What story are you creating now? She smiled sadly. I'm not sure yet. Everything I thought I knew about our family history, about you, about what constitutes success or value, it's all being recalibrated. I need time to process what this means. James Reed had moved to examine a cabinet I'd recently restored, giving us space for this more personal exchange. Now he rejoined the conversation with gentle authority. If I may offer one perspective, from someone who has witnessed similar patterns, he said, the wedding you're planning tells a story about what you value and who matters in your life. Is it the story you want to tell? Or is it someone else's narrative you've adopted without questioning its authenticity? Olivia and Chris exchanged a look that suggested this question had already emerged in their private conversations since my revelation about Riverstone. We've been talking about that, Chris acknowledged, about whether the event we're creating actually reflects what matters to us, or if it's primarily serving others' expectations. Dad would be furious if we changed the arrangements now, Olivia added, though her tone suggested this consideration no longer carried the weight it once had. All those business connections, the networking opportunities he's been cultivating, and my father's reaction would be similar, Chris agreed. But since seeing Riverstone, I keep asking myself, Are we beginning our marriage by honoring authentic relationships or by performing for strategic advantage? The question hung in the air, its implications extending far beyond wedding arrangements to the foundation of their life together. What kind of partnership were they creating? What values would guide their decisions? Whose approval would shape their choices? James Reed's phone chimed with a message notification. He checked it briefly, then looked up with an odd expression. "It seems we have another perspective joining our conversation," he said. "That was my son, Chris's father. Apparently, Robert Thompson contacted him about a situation regarding Riverstone Cottage, and they're on their way here now." The announcement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through our gathering. Robert's involvement suggested he had learned about my revelation to Olivia and was mobilizing his own response, likely in coordination with Reed's father, his development ally. "My father is coming here?" Chris asked, clearly surprised. "How would he even know where to find us?" "I imagine Robert told him," I suggested, processing this development. "Your father must have noticed my car is gone, and Robert would know exactly where to look." Olivia straightened, her attorney instincts visibly engaging. "Dad's probably planning to challenge the trust legally," she said. "He'll have convinced Mr. Reed that there's an opportunity to acquire Riverstone if they move quickly before the key amendment becomes widely known." The assessment made perfect sense given Robert's approach to conflict and opportunity. He would frame this as a business situation requiring immediate action rather than a family matter deserving careful consideration. "What do you want to do?" Chris asked me. "It's your property. We can leave if you prefer not to have this confrontation." I considered the question carefully. For 28 years, I had protected Riverstone through silence and strategic avoidance. Perhaps it was time for a different approach. "I think it's appropriate for all concerned parties to understand the situation clearly," I decided, "including the legal status of Riverstone and the choices now facing all of us." James Reed nodded approvingly. "Transparency is generally the best policy, even when temporarily uncomfortable." We moved to the stone patio overlooking the river, a space my grandfather had created for family gatherings that had hosted decades of celebrations before the divorce. As we arranged chairs and I prepared coffee, I noticed Olivia moving differently through the space, touching the stone wall with recognition, pausing to look at certain views as though reconciling adult perception with childhood memory. "I forgot. How beautiful it is here," she said quietly as she helped me arrange cups on the tray. "Or maybe I never fully appreciated it as a child. The way the light filters through the trees onto the water. It's always changing, but somehow always the same." The observation revealed a capacity for noticing subtle beauty that I had feared might have been completely overshadowed by her professional focus on measurable outcomes and strategic advantage. Perhaps that sensitivity hadn't been lost, but merely suppressed beneath layers of acquired values. We had just settled on the patio when two more vehicles appeared on the gravel drive. Robert's distinctive luxury sedan followed by an equally impressive SUV. The synchronized arrival suggested they had met elsewhere before coming to Riverstone, likely coordinating their approach to whatever situation they believed existed. Robert emerged first, his confident stride and immaculate appearance unchanged from our marriage. Even approaching 60, he maintained the polished image that had initially attracted me in my 20s, now recognizable as careful packaging rather than authentic presence. From the SUV stepped a man who could only be Chris's father, similar build and features to his son, but with James Reed's confidence hardened into something more rigid and calculated. "This should be interesting," James murmured as they approached. "My son rarely makes personal appearances unless he believes significant assets are at stake." As they drew closer, I could see the moment Robert registered not just my presence, but the gathering on the patio, his daughter, his daughter's fiancé, and most surprisingly, the elder James Reed. The confident expression faltered briefly, before reasserting itself with practiced control. "Olivia," he called, quickening his pace. "I've been trying to reach you. There's a situation developing that affects your future interests." "We're aware, Dad," she replied calmly. "Mom has explained everything about Riverstone Cottage." Robert reached the patio steps, Chris's father close behind him. Both men surveyed the gathering with barely disguised calculation, visibly reassessing whatever approach they had planned. "Margaret," Robert acknowledged me with stiff formality, "I see you've decided to reveal your arrangement regarding this property." After 28 years, it seemed time for transparency, I agreed. Particularly when I learned Olivia was being excluded from significant information about her heritage. Robert's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. He turned to the man beside him. "William, this is my ex-wife, Margaret Thompson. Margaret, this is William Reed, CEO of Reed Development Group." William Reed nodded curtly in my direction before his attention shifted to his father with evident surprise. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Appreciating extraordinary craftsmanship," the elder Reed replied mildly. "Something our family used to value before profit margins became the only measure of success." The gentle rebuke created a moment of awkward silence, highlighting the generational value shifts in both families. Robert, ever strategic, redirected the conversation. "Olivia, we need to discuss the legal implications of what's happening. Your mother has apparently maintained hidden assets throughout the divorce proceedings and subsequent years, assets that should have been properly disclosed and divided." "That's an interesting interpretation," I noted calmly. "James Sullivan might characterize it differently, considering he helped establish the Historic Preservation Trust 6 months before divorce proceedings began." The mention of James Sullivan, whose reputation in property law was formidable, caused Robert to recalculate visibly. He turned to William Reed, communicating silently in the way business partners develop over years of collaboration. "The trust may have legal standing," William acknowledged, addressing Robert while studying the property with a developer's eye. "But there are always avenues to explore when valuable riverfront acreage is involved. 5 acres with historic designation and restoration covenants," I clarified. "Any development plans would require navigating significant preservation restrictions." William smiled thinly. "Restrictions can be addressed with the right approach and resources, or respected as protecting something valuable beyond its market." "Price!" James Reed countered, the philosophical divide between father and son becoming increasingly apparent. Throughout this exchange, I noticed Olivia watching everyone carefully, not participating, but observing the dynamics with her attorney's analytical skill. Chris remained similarly quiet, his attention moving between his father, his grandfather, and Olivia, seemingly gauging reactions and connections. Robert, growing impatient with these philosophical tangents, focused on practical leverage. The property value aside, there's the matter of deception spanning decades. The courts take a dim view of hidden assets in divorce settlements, regardless of technical legal structures. Before I could respond, Olivia stepped forward. "Let's be clear about what's happening here," she said, her professional voice emerging. "Mom created a legal trust to protect a family property with significant historical and personal value. She maintained it through decades of personal effort and financial sacrifice, while allowing others to believe it had been lost." She turned to face her father directly. "And now that you've discovered its continued existence, your response isn't appreciation for what's been preserved, but immediate strategizing about how to claim, control, or profit from it." Robert blinked, clearly unprepared for his daughter to frame the situation in these terms. "This isn't about profit, Olivia. It's about rightful ownership and disclosure. Your mother saved something precious from being destroyed," Olivia interrupted. "Something that connects 5 generations of our family. Something I didn't even realize I had lost until I saw it again." Her hand reached out to touch the stone wall of the patio, the same stones her great-grandfather had carefully placed almost a century earlier. "This isn't just property, Dad. It's our history, our legacy, the physical embodiment of values that constructed something meant to last rather than simply appreciate in market value." The eloquent defense of Riverstone's significance, coming from my daughter who had so recently dismissed my preservation work as quaint and limited, created a profound shift in the gathering's energy. Robert seemed temporarily at a loss for words, confronted with a perspective from Olivia that didn't align with the ally he had expected. William Reed, less emotionally invested in our family dynamics, maintained his developer's focus. Historical significance notwithstanding, the property represents substantial value that appears to have been deliberately concealed during financial proceedings that should have included full disclosure. "An interesting perspective," James Reed commented mildly, "particularly coming from someone who restructured the family company to minimize my ownership share while I was recovering from surgery." This unexpected revelation created another ripple of tension. Chris turned to his father with evident surprise. "You restructured while Grandpa was hospitalized? You told me he voluntarily reduced his involvement for health reasons." William's expression hardened. "That's not relevant to the current situation." "On the contrary," James disagreed. "It seems entirely relevant to a pattern of behavior in both families. The prioritization of control and financial advantage over relationships and shared heritage." The parallel landed heavily in the afternoon air. For a moment, no one spoke as the implications resonated across generational lines. Two fathers who had prioritized material gain over preservation of what might have greater, if less tangible, value. Olivia broke the silence, addressing both Robert and William directly. "I think what's becoming clear is that this isn't primarily a legal or financial situation. It's about recognizing what different generations value and the legacies we choose to honor or discard." She moved to stand beside me, a physical indication of alignment that surprised everyone present, perhaps even Olivia herself. "Mom has preserved Riverstone for 28 years, not as a financial asset, but as living history. That preservation deserves respect, not legal threats or development schemes." Robert, always quick to reassess when momentum shifted, adopted a more conciliatory tone. "No one is suggesting immediate legal action, Olivia. We're simply trying to understand the full picture and ensure everyone's interests are properly represented." "My interests have been clearly stated," I interjected calmly. "The trust amendment provides a 1-year window before the donation to the Historic Preservation Society becomes irrevocable. What happens during that year depends on how various parties demonstrate their understanding of what Riverstone represents." William Reed's attention sharpened at the mention of the amendment. "Donation? You're planning to donate a property of this value?" "To ensure it remains intact and preserved according to my family's vision," I confirmed. "Unless certain perspectives evolve during the coming year." The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. The future of Riverstone depended on recognition of its true value beyond market price, particularly regarding my place in my daughter's life and significant moments. James Reed tapped his wooden cane thoughtfully against the stone patio. "It seems both our families are at similar crossroads," he observed, "choosing between honoring what previous generations built or pursuing what appears momentarily advantageous." He looked meaningfully at his son and grandson, including or excluding voices that might remind us of values we've gradually abandoned. The observation created another moment of uncomfortable silence. Chris moved to stand beside Olivia, creating a visual alignment with her position next to me. The younger generation physically separating themselves from their father's stance. "Actually," Chris said with newfound confidence, "Olivia and I have been reconsidering several aspects of our wedding plans since seeing Riverstone." Robert's attention snapped to his daughter. What aspects? Everything has been arranged according to the parameters we discussed. That's precisely what we're reconsidering, Olivia replied. Whether those parameters truly reflect what matters most as we begin our marriage. William Reed frowned. The guest list has been carefully curated to maximize strategic connections beneficial to both families. Adjustments at this stage would be highly disruptive. Perhaps disruption is exactly what's needed, Chris suggested, glancing at his grandfather, with newfound appreciation. A reset that prioritizes authentic relationships over networking opportunities. The conversation had shifted dramatically from its original trajectory. What had begun as Robert and William's coordinated attempt to assert control over Riverstone had evolved into a much deeper examination of values across 3 generations in both families. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, casting long shadows across the stone patio, I noticed a subtle but significant change in how everyone engaged with the space. Rather than viewing Riverstone as property to be claimed or developed, they had begun experiencing it as I always had, as a living repository of craftsmanship and care. Something that connected past to future through tangible presence. Even William Reed, despite his developer's instincts, had begun running his hand appreciatively along the stone wall, noting aloud the quality of the masonry work. Robert, though still clearly calculating potential legal approaches, had fallen into uncharacteristic silence as he watched his daughter move through the space with growing recognition of its significance. The conversation continued as twilight approached, moving beyond initial confrontation into something more nuanced, an intergenerational negotiation not just about property or wedding plans, but about what each family truly valued and how those values would shape their collective future. As lighting became necessary, I lit the hurricane lamps placed strategically around the patio, another element of Riverstone that blended function with beauty, tradition with practicality. The warm glow created an atmosphere that seemed to soften the remaining tension, inviting more authentic exchange. What exactly are you considering regarding the wedding? Robert finally asked Olivia directly, his tone more curious than demanding. She exchanged a glance with Chris before responding. We're questioning whether the event we've been planning actually reflects what matters most to us, or if it's primarily serving others' expectations and agendas. The business connections, William began, but Chris gently interrupted. We'll still be available through other channels, he assured his father. But perhaps our wedding day should prioritize family relationships that might not be available indefinitely. His meaningful glance toward both his grandfather and me underscored the point that excluding elder generations represented a loss that business advantages couldn't justify or replace. As the conversation continued into evening, nothing was definitively resolved. Robert and William maintained their positions regarding Riverstone's financial implications, while James Reed and I emphasized its significance beyond market valuation. But something had shifted in how Olivia and Chris positioned themselves within this generational divide. No longer automatically aligned with their father's perspectives, but increasingly capable of independent assessment. When Robert and William finally departed, neither had secured the leverage they had initially sought. Instead, they left with a new awareness of their children's evolving priorities and the growing influence of perspectives they had previously dismissed. James Reed remained behind briefly, examining some of the workshop's historical tools by lamplight before Chris helped him back to their car. As they prepared to leave, the elder Reed paused beside me. What you've preserved here goes beyond craftsmanship, he said quietly. It's a way of seeing the world, valuing substance over appearance, care over convenience, relationships over advantage. Don't underestimate how rare and needed that perspective has become. I thanked him for understanding what many others had failed to recognize. As their car disappeared down the gravel drive, Olivia lingered behind, clearly reluctant to end our time together despite the emotional complexity of the day. Would you mind if I stayed a bit longer? She asked hesitantly. There's something I'd like to discuss with you alone." I agreed readily, and we returned to the patio where the hurricane lamps created pools of warm light against the gathering darkness. For several minutes, Olivia sat quietly beside me, watching the same view of the river that had framed so many family conversations across generations. "I keep thinking about something Grandpa used to say," she finally began, "about how you could judge the quality of craftsmanship by how it ages. That truly excellent work becomes more beautiful with time rather than deteriorating." I nodded, remembering my father's frequent observation about both materials and relationships. "I think I've been measuring success by entirely different standards," Olivia continued thoughtfully. "Immediate results, visible achievements, strategic positioning. But seeing Riverstone after all these years, how it's not just survived but deepened in character and beauty, it makes me question whether I've been valuing the right things." The self-reflection revealed a capacity for growth I had feared might have been completely overshadowed by professional ambition and Robert's influence. I waited, giving her space to continue this thread of realization. "I don't want to be someone who would exclude her mother from her wedding," she said finally, meeting my eyes directly. "I don't want to begin my marriage by prioritizing business, connections over authentic relationships. And I don't want to spend my life accumulating advantages while losing connection to what truly lasts." The sincerity in her voice touched me deeply. This wasn't a strategic concession, but a genuine reassessment of values that had been gradually absorbed without conscious examination. "What are you thinking about the wedding now?" I asked carefully. Olivia smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Actually, I have a rather significant question to ask you. Something Chris and I have been discussing since seeing Riverstone." She took a deep breath, as though gathering courage for something momentous. "Would you consider allowing us to hold our wedding here? Not at the Bellevue Estate with its strategic guest list, but here at Riverstone, where 5 generations of our family have created something meaningful and lasting." The request caught me completely by surprise. From being excluded from attending her wedding to having Riverstone proposed as the venue represented such a dramatic reversal that I found myself momentarily speechless. "Here?" I finally managed. "You want to be married at Riverstone?" Olivia nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and vulnerability I hadn't seen since she was much younger. We realized this place embodies everything a marriage should aspire to: careful attention to detail, patience through difficult seasons, commitment to quality that isn't immediately visible, appreciation for both heritage and possibility. She gestured toward the cottage and surrounding grounds. "People create elaborate wedding venues trying to manufacture what already exists here naturally: authenticity, character, meaningful connection to something larger than immediate convenience." The thoughtfulness of this assessment, recognizing Riverstone's symbolic alignment with marriage itself, revealed depths to Olivia's thinking that had been obscured by her professional persona. Perhaps the capacity for noticing meaning beyond. Market value had never been lost but simply redirected. "And the guest list?" I asked, processing this unexpected proposal. "Your father's business connections? The Reed family's network?" "We're reconsidering everything," Olivia admitted. "Scaling back significantly to include people who truly matter in our lives, rather than strategic connections we barely know. It won't be easy. Dad and William will resist strenuously. But it feels right in a way the original plans never did." She reached for my hand, an uncharacteristically open gesture from my usually reserved daughter. "And most importantly, we want you fully involved, not just attending but helping create the day. This is your home, your heritage that you've preserved against incredible odds. We want to honor that, not just with our presence, but with our most significant beginning." The sincerity of this intention brought unexpected tears to my eyes. For decades, I had maintained Riverstone without recognition or appreciation from those whose legacy I was preserving. Now my daughter was not only acknowledging that effort, but asking to incorporate it into the foundation of her marriage. "I would be honored," I said simply, my voice steadier than I felt. Riverstone has always been meant for family celebrations, even during all those years when celebrations happened elsewhere. Olivia's relief was visible, her body language relaxing as though releasing tension long held. "There's one more thing," she added, her expression growing serious again. "Something even more significant than the venue." She took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking about who should walk me down the aisle. The traditional role would naturally fall to Robert, something I had never questioned despite our difficult history. The possibility that she might be reconsidering this convention hadn't occurred to me. Dad has always assumed he would have that role," Olivia acknowledged. "But since seeing Riverstone, since understanding what you've preserved and protected, all these years I've been reconsidering what that moment should represent." She looked at me directly, her expression resolute despite the cultural weight of what she was about to propose. "I'd like both of you to walk me down the aisle," she said finally. "Not just Dad representing one part of my heritage, but you as, well, honoring the craftsmanship, care, and quiet dedication that built something meant to last. Both influences together, creating a more complete understanding of where I come from and what I value." The request to have both her parents walk her down the aisle was unprecedented in our family. I watched Olivia's determined expression, so different from the corporate mask she typically wore. In that moment, I saw glimpses of the young girl who used to help me sort wood scraps in the workshop at Riverstone, categorizing them by grain pattern before she knew what the technical terms meant. "Dad won't be happy about sharing this role," I cautioned, wanting her to understand the potential conflict ahead. "I know," she replied, a calm confidence in her voice that hadn't been there when she'd called to uninvite me weeks earlier. "But this isn't about making Dad happy anymore. It's about honoring what's true." In the 2 weeks that followed, Riverstone Cottage transformed, not through dramatic renovation or modernization, but through careful preparation that respected its authentic character while adapting it for celebration. Chris and his grandfather James spent hours discussing lighting placements that would enhance rather than overpower the natural beauty of the setting. Olivia worked alongside me in areas she'd once considered outdated, discovering value in details she'd previously overlooked. Robert's reaction to the dual escort proposal unfolded exactly as expected. First came flat refusal, followed by financial, leverage attempts, and finally reluctant accommodation when he realized Olivia wouldn't yield. What surprised me was William Reed's parallel journey, mirroring Robert's resistance to having his father play a prominent role in the ceremony. "It's as though they're afraid of being overshadowed," James Reed observed as we arranged seating along the riverbank. "Not by us personally, but by what we represent. Connections to values they've spent decades dismissing as outdated or impractical." I nodded, recognizing the truth in his assessment. They built careers on replacing rather than restoring, on novelty rather than continuity. Our presence reminds them of roads not taken. As the guest list underwent dramatic revision, prioritizing meaningful relationships over strategic connections, both fathers struggled to adjust their perspectives. The networking opportunity they'd envisioned was transforming into something neither could fully control, an authentic celebration rather than a career advancement vehicle. 3 days before the wedding, I found Olivia in the workshop, carefully sanding a small wooden box I recognized immediately. It was a jewelry case my father had started for her 13th birthday, but never completed before his passing. I'd preserved the unfinished piece, unable to bring myself to complete it, but unwilling to discard his final project. "I found this on the storage shelf," she said without looking up from her work. "I remember Grandpa showing me how he'd selected the maple burl specifically because the pattern resembled water ripples. He said it would be perfect for holding treasures from your river adventures," I added softly, memories flooding back. He planned to line it with cedar harvested from the fallen tree by the north boundary. Olivia nodded, continuing her careful sanding. I thought, maybe we could finish it together. I'd like to use it for the wedding rings tomorrow. The suggestion, completing my father's final project as a collaborative act spanning 3 generations, created an unexpected tightness in my throat. This wasn't just about a decorative box, but about reconnection to craftsmanship traditions she had dismissed for years as irrelevant to her modern life. I'd like that very much, I managed, reaching for my favorite finishing tools. The cedar lining pieces should still be in the materials cabinet. We worked together through the afternoon, her corporate attorney hands gradually remembering childhood, lessons in patience and precision. The box that emerged wasn't perfect by technical standards. A few sanding marks remained visible, the hinges aligned slightly off-center, but its authenticity made it more meaningful than any professionally crafted alternative could have been. It's strange, Olivia reflected as we applied the final coat of oil to bring out the wood's natural luster. A month ago, I would have considered this rustic and limited, compared to the engraved silver ring box we'd ordered. Now I can't imagine using anything else. Her observation captured the fundamental shift occurring not just in wedding preparations, but in her broader perspective. What she had once viewed as constraints, tradition, craftsmanship, connection to place, she was beginning to recognize as foundations that could support rather than limit her future. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect early autumn. Weather that showcased Riverstone at its most beautiful. The property seemed to respond to renewed appreciation, sunlight highlighting details that had waited decades for recognition. The hand-carved banister posts, the Riverstone pathway, laid by my grandfather, window frames my father had constructed from a single oak that once stood where the ceremony would now take place. Unlike conventional venues with designated preparation spaces, Riverstone's adaptation required thoughtful consideration. Olivia prepared in my bedroom, which had once been hers during childhood weekends at the cottage. Chris and his groomsmen gathered in the renovated carriage house where James Reed shared family stories that might otherwise have been lost between generations. The property became not just setting, but active participant in the day's meaning. Robert arrived precisely on schedule, his expensive suit and carefully controlled expression contrasting with the natural setting. His eyes cataloged the property, with characteristic assessment, but something shifted in his gaze as he moved beyond initial impression to notice details that revealed decades of careful stewardship. "You've maintained the structural integrity remarkably well," he offered, as close to a compliment as his competitive nature would allow. The foundation work must have been challenging given the proximity to the riverbank. "My father engineered a drainage system using the natural topography," I explained, accepting this limited recognition without demanding more. "Each generation has adapted it slightly while maintaining the core design. Sustainable solutions usually require understanding what came before rather than starting fresh." The subtle critique of his development philosophy wasn't lost on Robert, but rather than defensiveness, I caught a flicker of something unexpected. Not agreement, but momentary consideration that alternative approaches might have legitimacy he hadn't previously acknowledged. As guests arrived, they naturally dispersed throughout Riverstone's grounds rather than remaining in designated areas. The property's organic flow encouraged exploration and conversation, creating interactions that might never have occurred in more structured settings. Business associates discovered common interests beyond professional connections. Family members separated by generational divides found unexpected common ground. Most significantly, I watched James Reed introduce his son William to several preservation-focused architects he'd invited, colleagues who had adapted historical buildings while maintaining their essential character and turned substantial profits in the process. This quiet challenge to William's assumption that preservation and profitability were fundamentally opposed created conversations that continued throughout the day, sometimes heated, but increasingly thoughtful. When the time came for the ceremony to begin, I met Robert and Olivia at the cottage's main entrance. The moment held potential for awkwardness or power struggle, but something unexpected happened as Olivia emerged in her wedding dress, a modern design that incorporated lace from my own gown, creating visual bridge between generations, just as the dual escort would do ceremonially. "You look beautiful," Robert said, momentary emotion cracking through his controlled facade. Then, without prompting or apparent struggle, he shifted slightly to create equal space on either side of our daughter. The choreography we hadn't rehearsed emerged naturally. Olivia between us, each parent supporting without possessing, both influences acknowledged without competition. The path to the ceremony space wound through gardens my mother had designed, past the workshop where 3 generations had practiced their craft, across the stone bridge my grandfather had constructed, and finally to the riverbank where guests had gathered in a natural amphitheater created by the sloping landscape. Each step connected Olivia literally and symbolically to heritage she had nearly dismissed as irrelevant to her contemporary life. When we reached James Sullivan, waiting beneath a simple wooden arch positioned where cultivated garden met natural riverbank, the symbolic boundary between human creation and natural world, he acknowledged our arrival with subtle nod that recognized the significance of this shared journey. "Who presents this woman to be married?" he asked, using traditional language while acknowledging with slight emphasis on presence rather than gives the modern understanding of marriage as shared choice rather than transfer of possession. "We do," Robert and I responded in unintended unison, the spontaneous harmony creating ripple of appreciative recognition through the gathering. As we released Olivia's arms simultaneously, allowing her to step forward independently while we stepped back, the gesture perfectly captured healthy family dynamics, supporting without constraining, honoring heritage while respecting autonomy. The ceremony itself balanced tradition with contemporary perspective, respecting established forms while adapting them to reflect genuine values rather than empty convention. When Olivia and Chris exchanged personalized vows, their carefully chosen words revealed how completely their perspectives had evolved in recent months. "I promise to value substance over appearance," Chris stated, glancing briefly toward his grandfather, "to recognize that meaningful creation requires patience rather than expedience, and to build our life together with the same attention to foundation that makes Riverstone a place of beauty and integrity." Olivia's corresponding promises incorporated similar recognition of previously undervalued principles. "I will approach our relationship as my family has approached craftsmanship, with respect for authentic materials, patience through challenging processes, and faith that genuine quality emerges through honest work rather than superficial enhancement." These weren't abstract sentiments, but specific commitments grounded in newly recognized values, spoken in place that physically embodied such principles. The location itself provided not just scenic backdrop, but living testament to what such commitments might produce when maintained through challenges across generations. As ceremony transitioned to celebration, Riverstone's varied spaces naturally accommodated different aspects of the gathering. The workshop became impromptu museum, where 5 generations of tools and techniques sparked conversations about the relationship between tradition and innovation. The cottage's main rooms offered quieter spaces for meaningful exchange between guests with diverse perspectives but shared appreciation for authenticity. The riverbank transformed into dance area where celebration continued as natural light faded and strategically placed lanterns created pools of warm illumination. What emerged most clearly throughout the evening was unexpected bridging of perspectives, previously held in opposition. Preservation advocates found themselves engaged in thoughtful conversation with development professionals about potential integration of their approaches. Older family members discovered their experiences actively sought by younger generations, newly conscious of wisdom they had nearly overlooked. Most significantly, the careful separation Robert had maintained between his former family connections and current professional circle gradually dissolved as evening progressed. Shared appreciation for Riverstone's authentic character created common ground that transcended artificial social divisions, allowing interactions based on genuine interest rather than strategic positioning. Near midnight, as younger guests continued, dancing while others began departing, I found myself alone briefly on the stone patio overlooking the river. The sounds of music and laughter created perfect counterpoint to the river's constant flow, human celebration harmonizing with natural continuity in ways that embodied Riverstone's essential character. Robert approached with uncharacteristic lack of agenda, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and offering one without his usual calculation. For several moments, we stood in surprisingly comfortable silence, watching celebration continue against backdrop of property I had preserved and he had dismissed. "I've been thinking about something James Sullivan said during the ceremony," he finally ventured, "about how quality reveals itself through how it responds to time and challenge." I nodded, allowing him space to continue rather than rushing to fill the silence between us. "What you've created here, preserved here, has quality I didn't recognize," he acknowledged, gesturing toward property illuminated by scattered lanterns against night sky. Not just maintained appearances, but genuine substance that speaks for itself when seen directly. Coming from Robert, whose professional success had been built largely on manipulating appearances and perceptions, this represented significant recognition. Not personal reconciliation or emotional reconnection, but professional acknowledgement of value beyond parameters he typically prioritized. "Riverstone was always meant to last," I replied simply. "Through changes in fashion, in ownership, in purpose. My father understood that, as did his father before him. I've just been caretaker of something larger than myself." "A philosophy quite different from development perspective," he observed without defensive edge, "where value is calculated primarily through immediate return rather than generational impact. Different measures for different purposes," I acknowledged. "Both have their place." This balanced response, neither yielding my valuation nor dismissing his entirely, seemed to satisfy something in Robert's assessment of our interaction. He nodded thoughtfully before raising his glass in subtle toast. "To quality that reveals itself through time," he offered, and to Olivia, who recognized it before I did. We touched glasses briefly, this minimal ceremony marking neither friendship restored nor conflict resolved, but mutual recognition of something valuable transcending our personal history. Sometimes acknowledgement, rather than reconciliation, represents significant progress in its own right. As Robert returned to other guests, Olivia appeared from direction of dancing area, her formal wedding appearance now comfortably disheveled from hours of celebration. She joined me on the patio, momentarily watching her father's retreating figure, before turning attention to property spread before us in evening shadow and scattered light. "I keep thinking about something you told me years ago," she said, leaning against stone wall that had supported 5 generations of similar contemplation, about how the most valuable things aren't always visible at first glance. That sometimes you have to look beneath surface damage or accumulated grime to recognize what matters. I smiled, remembering countless variations of this wisdom shared during restoration projects throughout her childhood, never imagining then how principle might eventually apply to our relationship itself. "You preserved all this when everyone else would have replaced it," she continued, gesturing toward Riverstone in its entirety. "Not just the structure, but the values it represents. Belief that some things deserve protection even when convenience argues otherwise." Her understanding went beyond appreciation for physical preservation to recognition of underlying philosophy guiding my choices through decades of challenge. This perception, seeing beyond visible craftsmanship to values sustaining it, represented most meaningful kind of recognition. "What matters most isn't that you maintained Riverstone itself," she added, her insight surprising me with its depth. It's that you never surrendered vision of what deserves preservation, even when those closest to you couldn't see its value. In that moment, standing beside my daughter as she articulated understanding I had never explicitly taught but demonstrated through decades of quiet commitment, I felt completion of circle begun generations earlier. My grandfather had created, my father had enhanced, I had protected, and now Olivia recognized, each generation contributing differently to continuous stewardship of something valuable beyond immediate utility. "Chris and I have been talking," she said after comfortable silence, "about spending more time here, about learning the restoration skills you've developed, not abandoning our careers entirely, but rebalancing priorities to include what we nearly overlooked." This wasn't sentimental nostalgia, but practical intention, beginning to integrate values she had recently recognized into forward-looking plans, rather than compartmentalizing them as interesting but irrelevant history. Not rejection of contemporary life, but enrichment through connection to authentic heritage that might otherwise have been permanently lost. "Riverstone has always been meant for family presence," I responded, genuine welcome mixing with recognition that sharing space I had maintained alone for decades would require adjustment. My solitary stewardship was necessary protection during challenging period, not ideal permanent arrangement. As wedding celebration continued around us, this quiet exchange represented day's most significant outcome, not just ceremonial inclusion or social reconnection, but fundamental recognition of values worth preserving across generations. The daughter who had once found my traditional skills and preservation focus embarrassingly limited now recognized these very approaches as foundation for meaningful legacy she hoped to incorporate into her own future. When she had called months earlier to explain why I wasn't welcome at her wedding, the values implicit in that decision had seemed immovable, calcified through years of professional reinforcement and paternal influence. Yet witnessing who ultimately walked her down aisle, not just Robert representing one set of values, but me embodying alternative priorities, revealed how dramatically perspective could shift when authentic connection replaced constructed narrative. As Olivia rejoined the celebration and I remained momentarily alone with these reflections, I understood that walking her down the aisle alongside Robert hadn't just represented ceremonial inclusion, but fundamental acknowledgement of dual influence, recognizing that meaningful heritage incorporates diverse contributions rather than requiring choice between competing alternatives. Sometimes what appears threatened remains simply waiting for recognition, like craftsmanship hidden beneath accumulated inappropriate finish or authentic connection obscured by artificial narrative. The key lies not in forcing immediate acknowledgement, but in patient preservation until natural perspective shift allows genuine appreciation to emerge without manipulation. The daughter who had once said I wasn't welcome at her wedding had ultimately recognized something essential about what I had preserved all along, not just a physical property, but approach to life that valued substance over appearance, authentic connection over strategic advantage, patient stewardship over immediate gratification. This recognition, seeing beyond surface narrative to appreciate substance previously overlooked, represented wedding's most significant gift. Not reconciliation that erased genuine differences or sentimentality that minimized real conflicts, but clear-eyed appreciation for contributions previously dismissed or devalued. As night deepened and celebration gradually transitioned toward conclusion, I felt peaceful certainty settle around me. Confidence not in perfect resolution of all family tensions, but in successful transmission of values worth preserving across generations. The river flows, craftsmanship endures, legacy continues, not through forced acknowledgement but patient demonstration that allows others to recognize authentic value in their own time, through their own journey of understanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.